I never imagined a wedding shower would be the night I finally chose my daughter over my own father-in-law. Looking back, the words he threw at her weren't what ended 23 years of keeping quiet. It was my grandson asking me afterward why Grandpa Walt hated us. But let me back up. The third Saturday in September was warm and gold in Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of afternoon where the mountains turned the color of honey and everybody said it was a perfect day for a party. My father-in-law's house sat up on a ridge with a wraparound porch and a view that made people stop talking when they first saw it. If you didn't know better, you'd think the Pruitt family had never had a single hard year in their lives. I almost believed it myself, most days. My daughter Sarah sat beside me in the car, straightening the ribbon on a scrapbook she'd spent 2 months putting together for her daughter Katie's wedding shower. Every page was hand-cut cardstock, photographs from Katie's childhood, little pressed flowers Sarah had dried herself from her own garden. "You think she'll like it?" Sarah asked me, the way she always asked when she was nervous. "She's going to cry," I said. In a good way. Sarah laughed, but I could hear the same old worry underneath it, the one that had been there since she married into that family 26 years ago. For the past 2 months, she'd spent almost every evening at her kitchen table with a glue gun and a shoebox of old photographs, piecing that scrapbook together page by page. Money had never been the point with Sarah. It never was. Time was the point. Love was the point. When we walked into Walt's house, the smell of Sarah's mother-in-law's famous pulled pork hit us before we even got through the door, mixed with citronella candles and somebody's expensive perfume. String lights were wound through the porch railings. Walt's second wife, Deborah, had hired an actual florist. Real hydrangeas everywhere in mason jars tied with silk ribbon. My son-in-law's sister, Candace, was arranging a mountain of gift bags beneath a table. Every single one, from a boutique downtown that I happen to know, charges $9 for a greeting card. Candace clocked Sarah's scrapbook the second we walked in. "Oh," she said, with a smile that stayed on her mouth and nowhere near her eyes. "You made something. Again." Katie, the bride, lit up like a firework. "Grandma Sarah made me a whole scrapbook." She practically ran across the yard to hug her. Candace watched them, arms crossed. "That's sweet," she said in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "I guess when you don't have the money for the registry stuff, you improvise." Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything. Sarah just kept smiling, the way she'd learned to keep smiling for over 2 decades. "It's from the heart," she said quietly. "Sure," Candace said, setting the scrapbook down on a side table instead of with the other gifts. "That's usually what people say." I looked over at Walt. He'd heard every word of it. He just sipped his bourbon and said nothing, the way he always said nothing. This wasn't new, and that was the part that ate at me most. For 26 years, I had watched 100 small moments exactly like this one. A comment about Sarah's clip-on earrings. A joke about the trailer park 2 towns over, where everybody knew Sarah had grown up before she met Walt's son. A remark about her years working the register at the pharmacy. Nothing loud enough to start a real fight. Just enough to leave a bruise nobody could see. And every single time, I had told myself it wasn't worth ruining somebody's birthday, somebody's holiday, somebody's shower. Every single time, Sarah had let it go and gone home, and cried quietly in the bathroom where she thought I couldn't hear her. My grandson Mason, 7 years old, tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Grandma, why doesn't Aunt Candace like your presents?" Sarah knelt down to his height. "Some people just show they're happy in different ways, sweetheart." I wish to God I believed that. Dinner started not long after. Conversation drifted the way it always did at that house, from Walt's golf handicap to Deborah's kitchen renovation to Candace's husband's new boat. Then, almost like it was nothing at all, Walt set down his fork and looked straight at Sarah. "You know," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "I still don't understand what my son saw in a girl who grew up on food stamps." A couple of nervous laughs rippled around the table. Sarah set her fork down slowly. "Walt." Her voice stayed even. "Please don't." Just that. 2 words. No shouting. No accusations. Walt stood up so fast his chair scraped against the porch boards. Before I understood what was happening, he'd crossed around the table, and his open hand cracked across Sarah's face. The whole yard went silent. Somebody's wine glass shattered on the flagstone. Sarah didn't even lift a hand to protect herself. Walt stood over her, his face red. "She's right to laugh," he said, cold as anything I'd ever heard. "You'll always be trash to this family. Take your husband and get out of my house." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I could hear cicadas in the trees like the whole world hadn't just cracked in half. Then I heard something worse. A small voice beside me. Grandpa. It's not. Mason's eyes filled up with tears. Did Grandpa Walt hit Grandma because we're poor? That question broke something loose in my chest that 26 years of small insults never had. I knelt down beside his chair and took both of his little hands in mine. No, buddy, I said, looking straight into his eyes. Grandpa Walt forgot what it means to be kind. That's all. That's not on you, and it's not on Grandma. Mason nodded, even though I could tell he didn't fully understand. Maybe he wasn't supposed to. Not yet. I stood up. Nobody else on that porch said a single word. Candace had her arms crossed like she just won a debate. Walt stood there waiting, I think, for somebody to apologize to him. Instead, I walked around the table to Sarah. A red handprint was already blooming across her cheek. You okay? I asked her quietly. She nodded, even though we both knew that was a lie. I helped her up out of her chair. Mason slung his own little backpack over his shoulder without anybody telling him to. As I reached for the scrapbook Candace had shoved to the side table, I noticed one corner of it had been crushed flat, probably stepped on in the commotion. The pressed flowers on the front cover crumbled to dust. I picked it up carefully anyway, tucked it under my arm, and carried it to the car. No goodbyes, no shouting on our way out, no threats. The drive back down the mountain felt longer than it should have. The sun was setting behind the ridgeline in long orange stripes, and nobody said a word for almost 15 minutes. Finally, Sarah whispered, I'm sorry. My hands tightened on the wheel. No, I said, and my voice cracked doing it. I'm the one who's sorry. She turned toward me. I spent 26 years asking you to be patient with them, she said. I should have spent 26 years asking them to be decent, I said. That's on me, not you. She reached over and held my hand the rest of the way home. That night, after Mason had fallen asleep on the couch under his dinosaur blanket, Sarah went up to bed early. I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long while. In the drawer under the phone book, there was an old envelope in my own father's handwriting, something he'd written me the year before he passed. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside was one line that suddenly felt less like advice and more like a warning I'd ignored for a quarter century. Son, one day you'll have to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your family. Choose your family. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it back up and slid it into my shirt pocket. My phone was buzzing on the counter when I finally stood up. Walt, Deborah, Candace, Walt again. I turned it face down and went to bed. The next morning, frost had come early to the ridge, the first cold snap of the fall. The coffee maker had just finished when I picked my phone back up. 19 missed calls. 1 voicemail. Walt's name on the screen. I pressed play. His voice was shaking in a way I had never once heard from that man in 26 years. Frank, call me back. We need to talk about this. I stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the frost still clinging to the grass. For the first time in 26 years, I did absolutely nothing. I wish I could tell you that ignoring those calls came easy. It didn't. I stood there with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands, while Walt's voicemail replayed itself in my head on a loop. 26 years of habit told me to grab my truck keys and go fix whatever had gone wrong over there, the way I always did. Because somebody had to, and it was never going to be Walt. Instead, I looked out the window. Mason was already outside in his little flannel jacket, kicking through the fallen leaves in the side yard, laughing about something with the neighbor's dog. Sarah stepped out onto the porch a minute later with 2 mugs of coffee, and I couldn't hear what she said to him, but I heard him laugh again, easy and loud. The way kids laugh when nothing is wrong in their world. For the first time in years, I realized my family was only the 3 of us standing in that yard. Everyone else was noise. The phone rang again. I flipped it face down without looking. Sarah came back inside a few minutes later. You don't have to decide anything today, she said gently. I'm not deciding today, I said. Then what are you doing? I thought about that for a long moment. Nothing, I said, and I almost smiled saying it. I'm doing nothing. That sounded simple. It wasn't. Doing nothing meant refusing to be the man who drove up that mountain to smooth things over one more time. Doing nothing meant letting somebody else, for once in 26 years, sit in the mess they'd made. By the 3rd day, another voicemail landed. This one was from Candace. Dad's heat pump is acting up, and it's supposed to freeze tonight. You still have the number for that HVAC guy, right? Call me. I knew that heat pump. I'd replaced the capacitor on it myself 2 winters back. Every October, I drove up there and checked the filters, bled the lines, made sure the old man wouldn't freeze in that big house of his. Because if I didn't do it, nobody would. And everybody up on that ridge knew it. I deleted the voicemail. That afternoon, a real cold front rolled down out of the mountains, and the local station put out a hard freeze warning for the whole county. Normally, I'd already be halfway up that ridge road with a toolbox rattling in the truck bed. Instead, I helped Mason finish the little birdhouse we'd started building the weekend before, the two of us out in the garage with sawdust on our sleeves while Sarah made cocoa in the kitchen. 3 days after that, my phone rang, and it was a number I didn't recognize. A lawyer's office in downtown Asheville. Walt's estate attorney, a man named Gerald Whitfield, who I'd met exactly twice in 26 years, both times at family functions where he drank Walt's bourbon and talked about fishing. "Frank," he said, "I think it's time we sat down. There are some things about the family trust you need to see." I hadn't wanted to go. After everything that happened at that shower, the last thing on earth I wanted was another room full of Pruitts. But something in his voice told me this wasn't about smoothing anything over. The next morning, I drove downtown. Walt was already in the conference room when I got there, looking smaller than I remembered him looking just a week before. Deborah sat beside him, and Candace had shown up uninvited, the way she always did whenever money was on the table. Gerald closed the door behind me and set a thick binder down in front of himself. "I've spent the last several days going through the Pruitt family trust," he said, "and the financial records Walt has kept, going back 12 years. Candace leaned forward. "Good, because he's been doing whatever he wants with that money for years." Gerald didn't even look at her. "I've also gone through every expense Frank has personally covered for this family since he was named successor trustee after Walt's heart surgery." He opened the binder. Property taxes on the Ridge House, page after page. A new roof after the ice storm 4 years back. The heat pump. 2 separate plumbing emergencies. Deborah's knee surgery co-pay the year her own insurance lapsed. Prescription costs. Emergency dental work for Candace's own son, paid quietly. Never mentioned again. The room got quieter with every page he turned. Finally, Gerald closed the binder. "I've reached one conclusion," he said. "Frank has done substantially more for this family than the trust ever required of him." Candace crossed her arms. "So?" Gerald looked at her for the first time. "The trust obligated Frank to manage the property and its assets responsibly. It never once required him to personally fund $30,000, $40,000 in family expenses out of his own retirement savings." Walt blinked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Gerald said, folding his hands, "that if Frank had acted strictly as trustee and nothing more, he would have recommended selling this house years ago. The upkeep has outpaced what the trust can sustain on its own for a long while now. Instead, Frank quietly covered the difference himself every single time for over a decade." Walt's face lost its color. "I didn't know that." "I believe you didn't," Gerald said, not unkindly. Candace finally spoke again. "Well, that's just what family does." Gerald looked at her properly this time. "No," he said, his voice staying perfectly even. "Family helps because they choose to. What you're describing is entitlement. Those are 2 very different things." Nobody argued with him, not even Candace. Gerald reached for a second folder. "There's one more matter." He slid a copy of the trust document across the table toward Walt. "You named Frank as successor trustee because you trusted his judgment more than anyone else's. After reviewing 12 years of his decisions, I'd say you were right to." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally, Candace pushed back her chair. "So that's it then?" "There's no legal claim here," Gerald said, "and if one were filed, it would fail. But there is something else worth saying." He looked toward me. "Frank stopped covering these costs the week after his daughter was assaulted at her own family's home and humiliated in front of her son. A court, or anyone with sense, would call that an entirely reasonable response." Candace had nothing left to say to that. The meeting ended quietly. No shouting, no speeches, just people standing up one by one, carrying something heavier out of that room than they'd carried in. Outside in the parking lot, Deborah caught up to me. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I kept thinking Walt just handled all of it himself. I never once asked how." "You don't owe me anything," I told her. "I do," she said. I should have paid better attention. We stood there another minute before we each drove our separate ways. Life settled into an unfamiliar rhythm after that. The phone stopped ringing every single day. Sarah laughed more and easier. Mason stopped asking whether Grandpa Walt hated us and started asking about his school science fair project instead, like a normal 7-year-old with normal 7-year-old problems. One Saturday afternoon, Mason came tearing into the garage while I was sorting through an old tackle box. "Grandpa, Grandpa, look!" He waved a certificate over his head. His elementary school had held a community art contest back in early fall, and the judging had run long because of some mix-up with the paperwork. The results had just come in. First place, ages 6 to 8, went to a bluebird he'd painted on a little wooden ornament, one Sarah had helped him carve and paint the same week as the shower, meant as a gift for his mother that never made it into anyone's hands that day. Sarah read the certificate twice and pulled him into a hug. "I am so proud of you." Mason looked up at her. "Do you think Grandpa Walt would like it now?" Sarah hesitated, then knelt down to his height. "I hope one day he understands why it matters," she said, "even if he doesn't yet." That answer stuck with me, not because it promised anything, because Sarah still hoped, even after all of it. Winter eased into spring. The leaves on the ridge came back green. Life got quieter than it had been in a long time. One evening, while I was out grilling on the back deck, Candace called. Her voice sounded different this time, tired. "Dad wants me to ask you something," she said. I waited. "He wants to know if he can see Mason." I looked through the kitchen window. Sarah and Mason were inside making lemonade, laughing over something that had spilled across the counter. The sight filled me with something like peace and something like caution, both at once. "I'll think about it," I said. "He knows he doesn't deserve it," Candace said. "I know he does," I said. A long silence set on the line. Then Candace said something I never expected to hear. "Frank, I think Dad's finally starting to understand what he actually lost that night." After we hung up, I stood alone on that back deck until the sun dropped behind the trees. A few days later, an envelope showed up in our mailbox. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, shaky but unmistakable. Walter Pruitt. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No excuse, no explanation. Just one handwritten line. "If you'll let me, I'd like to come to Mason's birthday in June." I folded the note back up and slipped it into the envelope. For a long time, I just sat there looking at it. Some wounds heal fast. Some need a lot more than an apology to close up right, and some decisions don't belong to the person who was hurt the least. I looked out the window toward Mason's room. If anybody deserved to make this call, it wasn't me. Mason's birthday landed on a warm Saturday in June, warmer than the forecast had promised. By noon, our backyard smelled like charcoal and cut grass and Sarah's homemade potato salad. Mason ran through the sprinkler with 2 kids from down the street, laughing so hard he nearly went down on the wet grass twice. Every few minutes, he'd stop just long enough to ask if the burgers were ready before tearing back off again. Watching him laugh like that, without looking over his shoulder, was something I still wasn't used to. Candace showed up first, carrying a bowl of baked beans, standing a little awkward at the gate. "You sure this is okay?" she asked. "I invited you," I said. "I wasn't talking about me," she said. I knew exactly who she meant. Before I could answer, another car eased into the driveway. Walt climbed out by himself. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, just older, worn down somewhere behind the eyes. He wasn't wearing his usual watch, no country club polo, just a plain button-down and work boots. In his hands was a small gift wrapped in plain brown paper. For a moment, nobody moved. Sarah reached for my hand. I squeezed it once. "It's your call," she whispered. "No," I said. "It's ours." Walt crossed the yard slow, one careful step at a time. When he reached us, he didn't try to hug anybody. He didn't even look at me first. He looked at Sarah. "I owe you something I never gave you," he said. Sarah waited. "My respect," he said. The words just hung there in the warm summer air. Walt took a slow breath. "I've been practicing this for weeks," he said, glancing around the yard. "Would everybody mind if I said it now?" Nobody objected. Candace pulled out a lawn chair for him. He didn't sit. He stood in front of all of us and unfolded a single sheet of paper from his shirt pocket. His hands were shaking. I spent most of my life pretending I came from somewhere better than I did, he said, looking down at the grass. My father drank away everything we ever had. We lived out of a single wide trailer behind the feed store for years. Sarah looked surprised. So did Candace. I hated it. Walt's voice cracked. I swore to myself I'd never be poor again. He paused. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being afraid of poverty and started being afraid of anybody who reminded me of it. Silence settled over the whole backyard. I judged you the day my son brought you home, he said to Sarah. I convinced myself where you grew up mattered more than the kind of woman you turned out to be. He wiped at one eye. When Candace made her little jokes, I should have shut it down. Instead, I laughed along. His eyes finally found Sarah's. And the slap. That's something I will regret every single day I have left. Sarah didn't say anything. Walt turned toward Mason. I also heard a boy who'd done nothing but love his grandmother. Mason instinctively stepped a little closer to his mom. I understand if you never forgive me for that, Walt said. He held out the small gift box. I brought something. He handed it to Sarah. She looked at me. I nodded. She carefully worked the ribbon loose. Inside was a small wooden ornament painted like a bluebird. Mason gasped. That's mine. That's the one I made. It was. The paint had been touched up carefully, a fresh coat over the old. A hairline crack still ran along one wing if you looked close. Walt noticed Mason tracing it with one finger. I couldn't make it disappear, Walt said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I found it in the grass after you all left that day, and I kept it. I thought if I could learn to fix it, maybe I'd learn how to fix what I did. Sarah looked at him. You kept it all this time? Walt nodded. Every piece. Nobody rushed to fill the quiet that followed. Some moments just deserve it. Mason looked up at me. Grandpa? I knelt down beside him, the same way I had 6 months before at that shower. Yeah, buddy. He glanced toward Walt. Are you still mad at him? I smiled at him, gently as I could. How I feel isn't the important thing right now, I said. He frowned. It's not? I shook my head. You got hurt too. This is your call to make, not mine. He looked back at Walt, then at his mom, then at me one more time. What happens now? I put a handlight on his shoulder. That's up to you. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slow across the yard. Walt stayed exactly where he was, didn't reach out, didn't ask for anything. Mason stopped in front of him. My bird's not perfect anymore, Mason said, looking at the crack. Walt nodded. I know. Mason thought about that for a second. Neither is our family. Then he wrapped both his little arms around his grandfather's waist. Walt broke down, crying right there into the boy's shoulder. Sarah leaned into me. I wasn't expecting that, she said. Neither was I told her. A few minutes later, everybody sat down to eat. Nobody talked loud. Nobody forced anything. It was careful, all of it. And somehow that felt more honest than every fake smile we'd traded around that ridge house for 26 years. After the food, Candace helped me clean the grill. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I should have carried more of the weight all those years instead of watching you carry it. You can start now, I said. She nodded. I will. For the first time, I believed her. As the sun started to drop, Walt came over one last time. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, he said. They won't, I said honestly. He lowered his head. I know, but we'll visit. If that's still all right. There'll be boundaries, I said. No insults, he said. None, I said. No comments about Sarah. Not ever again. And if Mason ever feels unwelcome in your house or mine, you'll leave, I finished for him. He nodded slow. I would too. When he drove off that evening, I realized something. I didn't feel like I'd won anything, because this had never really been about winning in the first place. It was about finally choosing, out loud, the people who'd been quietly choosing me every single day for years. Later that night, after the fireflies came out and Mason had fallen asleep with his repaired little bluebird sitting on his nightstand, Sarah and I sat together out on the back porch. She rested her head against my shoulder. You know, she said, your father was right. He usually was, I said. He told you to protect your family. I looked through the window toward Mason's room. I finally did, I said. The strange thing about boundaries is that they don't always push people away. Sometimes they turn out to be the only bridge strong enough to build something honest on. If there's one thing this whole mess taught me, it's that love should never ask you to trade away your family's dignity to keep it. The people who really love you will learn to respect where you draw the line, or they'll show you exactly why you had to draw it in the first place. If this story reminded you of somebody in your own life, thank you for spending this time with me. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting the people you love most, I hope you know you're not standing there alone. Sometimes protecting the people you love doesn't mean fighting louder. It means quietly stepping back and letting silence do the talking. A cracked ornament, taped and painted again, still holds every bit as much love as before. Boundaries aren't walls meant to keep people out forever. They're bridges waiting for someone brave enough to walk back across them, ready or not. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle lesson about family and forgiveness still finds a place in your heart.